We are going to be using some of the concepts that Ramon addressed, and we're going to be looking at an application that exists in the wild and how we can convert it to use hooks. But before we get started, a little bit about myself. I'm an engineer at Improbable, where we're building a platform that makes it easy to build massively multiplayer online role-playing games, and you don't have to host your own infrastructure to do so. I work on a team that builds debugging tools so that you can see what's going on in your game in real time. These debugging tools are browser-based. We write a lot of our components in React, so I use React a lot. And there's a couple of links on there for my info online if you'd like to get in touch. So what's the point of this talk? We just got a sense of what we can do with hooks, what some of the best practices are. In this talk, we're going to figure out how we can actually rip out bits of our application to start using hooks now. And what we're going to do is actually completely replace Redux and React Redux in an existing application. And hooks are so powerful that it's actually pretty easy to do. And we're going to look at some best practices for refactoring real applications in the process. There's a bunch of patterns that we can replicate with hooks. The React developers had a lot of best practices and common patterns in mind when they created the Hooks API. So we saw from Ramon that we can implement component statefulness using hooks. We can implement some context features using hooks. We can do a bunch of side effects, memoization. But in this talk, we're basically going to be looking at only two hooks, the useReducer hook, which we're going to use to introduce component statefulness. And we're also going to use the useContext hook to use context in our component. And the application we're going to be refactoring is to-do MVC. For anyone who's not familiar with to-do MVC, it's just a simple and straightforward JavaScript application that is commonly re-implemented when a new JavaScript library is introduced. The idea being, if a lot of people are familiar with this app and they read some new code that builds the same app, then they'll understand how the new framework works. And I just pulled the code that we're going to be refactoring directly from the Redux repo. So down here in the bottom left, there's a link to the code that we're going to be working with. So the basic steps for pulling out Redux and React Redux from this app are going to be, first of all, to figure out how we actually are using Redux and React Redux and what they're doing for us. And then once we've figured out where in the application we're using these dependencies, we're going to decide which hooks we can use to replace them. And then finally, once we've figured out which hooks we're going to use and figure out where we're going to use the hooks, we're actually going to re-implement the Redux and React Redux interfaces so that we can replace these dependencies with minimal changes to our code. And eventually we're going to see that it actually requires shockingly few changes to the code base to replace these dependencies. So let's get started. I'm going to hand over the mic here because we don't have a stand. Thank you, Casey. Okay. So what we're looking at here is the to-do Mvc source code. Is there anyone in the back who can't read the text? Okay, I'm going to make the text bigger. Thank you. Wow, that was still pretty small. Okay. Let's see what happens when it does a thing. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, is this any better, or should I'll just make it substantially bigger? And yeah. How's that? Good? Can see it in the back? Okay. So what we're looking at here is the source code for to-do MVC. Let's just take a quick tour through the source code and see what's going on. So we'll first look at the package JSON. And the first thing to note is that we've bumped the React version here. So we can see that we're using this alpha version, and you need to do something like this to get access to hooks. It's supported from 16.7, so make sure your React version is bumped if you want to use this yourself. So if we continue to look through the source code, our index.js file is the root. It's basically just rendering this app. And actually, let's take a look at what this thing does. So we've just got this ability to add, remove, and edit to-dos. We just have one to do, replace Redux. We're done using it, and it's not done yet. So let's try to figure out how we're using Redux and React Redux. So I'm just going to do a quick search for where we're using Redux. And it looks like, well, my presentation software doesn't like the larger screen. Okay, so much for that. So we're only using Redux in one place, which is in index.js. So let's take a look at where we're using Redux. So I'm just going to open up index.js. And we can see that the only place that we're really using this is to create a store. And once we've got this store, we pass it down to the rest of our component tree using this other dependency from React Redux. From React Redux, which we'll look at in a second. So we have this one usage of Redux, which is to create a store, which is going to contain our application state and allow us to make state changes. Let's see where else we're using Redux. These other usages of Redux are just helper functions, and these are just pure functions. They're really simple, and they don't have anything to do with the core operation of Redux, so we'll worry about replacing them later. So how about React Redux? Let's figure out where we're using React Redux. So it looks like we're using it in a few places, and the first place is also in our index.js file. So we're passing in our store to this provider, and the provider has the responsibility of supplying the store to the rest of our component tree via context. So if you think about what this is doing, we have a provider at the root of our component tree, and then it exposes via context the store, including the state and the dispatch function, to all of the components in our tree. So we're going to need to find some way to replicate this functionality using a hook. And let's see what other usages of the React Redux we have. So we also have these connect functions, and these are all called from containers. So let's see what's going on here. So I'm going to open up a container, and we can see that we're using this connect function. We're supplying it with a couple of functions, and it returns another function which accepts a React component, returns another component. And this connect function has the responsibility of retrieving the store from context and then supplying the store state to the component that we want to render. And the map state to props function gets passed the component state, or excuse me, the store state, and the map dispatch to props function gets passed the dispatch function. So we're going to need to find a hook that's able to provide this functionality for us as well. So now we have some idea of the functionality that we're going to need to implement with hooks. The first is the Redux store itself. So we're going to need to find some way to replicate this store with a hook. And then the second functionality is the connect function. So our store function has two important methods on it. It has a dispatch function, which allows us to make state changes, so we can pass in an action here. And this will cause a state change to occur on the store, and we can also ask the store what state is in it. So we need ways to do both of these operations. We need to be able to make state changes with the dispatch function, and we want to be able to get state changes with getState. And crucially, we want to rewrite as little code as possible. So we don't want to have to re-architect our actions and our reducers to be able to use whatever store we come up with. So let's get started. We're going to put our interface reimplementations in a file that we're just going to call state.js. So I'm opening up state.js here. And we're going to start with our provider function. So our provider function, if we remember, needs to pass the store down through our component tree via context. So the first thing is we need to get a store somehow. So we somehow get a store. And then what happens once we have a store? Well, we need to supply this via context to the rest of the component tree. So we're going to need a context provider that we also get somehow. And then once we have a store and a context provider, what we can do is supply this context provider with the store. And inside this context provider, we're just going to render the rest of our component tree. And this children is just a prop. So now we've got a provider, but we don't have a store and we don't have a context provider. So it's pretty easy for us to get a context provider. What we're going to do is we're going to grab the React dependency. And then we're going to make ourselves a context that we're going to call store context. And this null value that we're passing in is just the initial value of the context, but it doesn't matter to us because we're explicitly passing in the value of the context here. So now we have some context, and we can get a provider from this context. So we're just going to grab a provider off of the context. And now we've got a context provider. So we don't need to do this anymore. So now we just need to get a store. And how are we going to get a store? It turns out that the React developers had a use case very similar to this in mind when they created hooks. And there's a hook that is almost perfectly API compatible with Redux that we can just use out of the box. And that hook is called useReducer. So we're going to grab the useReducer hook. And this hook is going to allow us to get a store API really easily. And I happen to know that to use the useReducer API, we're also going to need a reducer. So we're going to grab the reducer from the directory in here. OK, so now that we've got our reducer and we have a hook that's going to let us get a Redux-like API, we can ask Redux to give us the Redux API. We can say, I want to use a reducer based on the dependency, the reducer function, and we also need to pass an initial state. And how do we get this initial state? Well, we just call our reducer function with undefined as the starting state. And we also need to pass in a special action here. And this action doesn't really need to be anything in particular, but Redux uses this funky looking thing here. You don't actually need to use this particular action, but this happens to be what Redux uses. So now we have our initial state, and now we can construct our store. And our store is just going to have state and a dispatch function. OK, so now we've got a provider. It's looking pretty good. Let's go back to our index.js file and swap out this provider. So we're just going to switch this over to our state file. And let's see what happens. Provider is not exported from state.js. It would help if it was exported. So we're getting an error here. And React Redux is complaining about store not being in context. And that's because we're using context that has a different shape than what React Redux is expecting. And this is fine, because we're going to be throwing out all of React Redux anyway. So we don't have to worry about the context being the right shape. So it looks like our provider is doing something. Let's go ahead and move on to our connect function. So the next thing we want to do is a connect function. It's going to be exported this time. And we need to think about what the interface for this connect function is. So I'm just going to open up one of our containers in here, and we can see how the connect function is invoked. So we pass in two functions to the connect function, map state to props and map dispatch to props. And then what happens from here? Well, we're returning another function, and this function accepts a React component. And finally, it returns another React component. And this is our basic API. We just need to figure out what happens inside our connected component. So inside our connected component, if we think about what we're trying to do here, we need to grab our store, and then we need to find the props that we're going to use to render our component. And then finally, we need to render the component. So if we think about what might tell us which bit of this we're going to use a hook for, we can think about in what circumstances we would want our component to re-render. Well, if the state changes, then we want the component to re-render. And the state's in the store. So this tells us that if the component needs to re-render when something changes, that's a good signal that we should use a hook there. And in fact, that's what we're going to do. We're going to use a hook that's going to cause the component to re-render whenever the state changes. And the same hook is actually going to fetch the state from context. So what we want is we want to just grab the store, get store somehow. And let's just go ahead and write some code that would be even nicer. What if we could just write use store? That would be really nice. So let's pretend this works and keep going. So we've got a store now. We just need to figure out which props we want to pass to this component. So the props that we pass in need to include the props from this component that we're rendering. in case we're not generating a prop that the component needs in our map state to props or map dispatch to props functions. And then what we're going to do is we're going to merge in our map state to props derived props. So we're going to use our store state here, and we're going to use the props that we passed in. And then finally, we're going to generate some props from map dispatch to props, and we're going to supply the dispatch function here. So now we've got these merged props, and we just want to render the component that we passed in. So we're just going to render this component, and we're going to pass in all of the props. OK, so this looks pretty good, but how about this use store business? So this looks like a great opportunity to use a custom hook. What if we just write a hook that somehow gives us a store? So let's write that hook. So we know that somewhere in the ancestry of our component tree, there is a context provider supplying us with a store. And the Redux developers gave us a great hook for getting values out of context. It's called the useContext hook. And since we know that our store is in context, we can just say, give me the value in context in the name of our context, store context. So we'll just grab the store out. And in fact, all we're doing is returning this. So our use store custom hook is very simple. It just grabs the store directly out of context. So this connect function looks OK. The next step, I'm just going to clean up some of these errors. So it looks like in our index.js file, that doesn't look right. And our, oh, OK. In our index.js file, we no longer need a few functions. So save this guy. We don't need reducer either. OK. And we're still getting the same error about our connect function. So now we need to swap out. We need to swap out the connect function in all of our React Redux, all the files using React Redux. So we're going to do some Vim magic here. We're going to grab all of the files in our containers directory. Looks OK. And then we're going to replace, we're going to do a quick find and replace of React Redux with state.js. And then we're going to save all the files. And if we open up some containers, it looks like we've swapped it out. Cool. So let's see what's going on over here. Map state to props is not a function. So what's going on here is it's complaining because we haven't supplied a function as the first argument to connect. So the connect function is kind of funky. It allows some weird invocations where you don't supply either map state to props or map dispatch to props, and it does something specific. When you don't supply map state to props, it expects you to generate no props from the state. And when you supply an object for map dispatch to props, it automatically binds the object to the dispatch function, assuming that all of the values of the object are action creators. So Redux has a helper for dealing with this situation. It's called bind action creators. So what we can do is we can write our own map dispatch to props function here. And we can say that we want to bind the add to do action creator to the dispatch function. And as for the null argument to map state to props, we can handle this back in state.js. So we can just say if we get a nil map state to props, then we just want to replace it with a function that totally ignores the state and generates no props. OK, so let's see what's going on. Hey, we got a to-do MVC again. So it looks like everything's working. So just to be sure that we did what we thought we did, let's figure out if we're still using React Redux. So it looks like we've completely replaced React Redux, and let's see if we're using Redux anymore. So we're still using these helper functions. And in fact, we could replace these helper functions It's probably a little bit out of scope of this talk, but they're each about 10 lines. We don't strictly need to use them. We could just do the thing in here ourselves, but we could replace them. So to recap a little bit on how this worked, we first looked at what we were doing to supply our Redux store to our component tree. We realized that we were supplying it via context using a context provider. So we wrote a function in state.js that creates a API compatible store using the useReducer hook. And then we supplied this value to our component tree ourselves. And then now that we have a store in our component tree, we finally used the useContext hook in all the components that care about the store to extract the state from the store. And the way that we knew that these are the places that we needed to insert a hook is that when we saw that a component needed to re-render based on some state, we realized that, well, this would be a good opportunity to use a hook, and that was our main heuristic for deciding where we should use the hooks. And that's it. So we've just done a lightning tour of swapping out real dependencies in an application using hooks. And thanks a lot, everybody.